this month in Tashkent, the World Bank presented a new report analyzing Uzbekistan's services sector, a key pillar of the country's economy. The report examines both the challenges and opportunities for the sector's development and offers policy recommendations to enhance the performance of various subsectors. These recommendations aim to boost the sector's contribution to economic growth, job creation, and investment attraction. In this regard, Gaurav Nayyar, an economic advisor at the World Bank and one of the report's authors, joined us from Washington, D.C. to discuss the report's findings and conclusions.
Mr. Nayyar, thank you for joining us today. I want to start our discussion by asking why is Uzbekistan's services sector important and how has it helped the country's economic growth in recent years?
Well, thank you for your question and thanks for having me speak with you. I think the first big message is that the services sector is very large, right? It accounts for more than 50% of all jobs in Uzbekistan. So it is too large a sector to ignore. It employs so many people. At the same time, if you see how things have changed in recent decades in Uzbekistan, some numbers I'll give you. We show that the share of the services sector in Uzbekistan's total employment increased from about 37% in 1991 to more than 50% 30 years later. And what this structural transformation into the services sector signified was that all of the share of employment in agriculture that came down in these 30 years was basically absorbed by the services sector. So in that sense, in the last 3 decades, the services sector has led the process of structural transformation in Uzbekistan. And it's accounted for more than half of growth in all jobs and more than half of growth in value added or GDP during this time period. So it is a very large sector. It employs lots of people and it has contributed a lot, more than 50% to total growth, both in jobs and in value added in Uzbekistan over the last 30 years. So it's a very big, important sector.
It's predictable to have challenges in every sector. So what kind of challenges the services sector of Uzbekistan is facing nowadays?
Thank you. Yes, that's a great follow-up question. So what I told you so far was the good news, like you said, and then the bad news is the challenges. The one thing is that, at a very aggregate level, is that the expansion of the services sector in Uzbekistan has also been accompanied by increases in labor productivity. So the people employed in the sector have been getting more productive. Labor productivity over the last decade between, say, 2011 and 2021 increased by more than 5% per annum. And this productivity increase was higher than what was seen in other sectors of the economy, such as industry or agriculture. But despite this sort of strong labor productivity growth in recent times, labor productivity in services is still just a fraction of labor productivity in services that we see in some of the higher income countries, such as the United States, such as in Europe, and countries like that. And also at a more aggregate level, Uzbekistan's trade in services has not grown, as fast as trade in services has grown in the rest of the world. And also in terms of inflows of foreign direct investment into Uzbekistan in the services sector, while these inflows have gone up, these inflows are still a very small share of, say, the FDI inflows that Uzbekistan gets in the electricity, gas, utilities sector. So it's still quite small. And then there are very specific challenges related to the composition of the services sector in Uzbekistan. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that services is a term that captures a large set of very different economic activities. And what we see in Uzbekistan is that, the high productivity services, such as if you think of ICT services, professional services, financial services, so some of these high-skilled, high-productivity services account for less than 5% of all jobs in Uzbekistan, right? So it's a very small, or 5% of all services jobs. So the sectors or the services that are very productive don't employ lots of people. And on the other hand, you have many of the low-skilled services. If you think of retail services or hospitality services, these services are relatively less productive, but they employ more than 60% of all services jobs, right? So you have the situation where the productive services employ fewer people and the less productive services employ many more people. And then the third final challenge on this composition of the services sector is that if you see in the last 5 years, the social services, so public administration, the government sector, education, health, these services have contributed to more than 75% of all employment growth in the services sector in Uzbekistan. But these services actually don't have any linkages to the rest of the economy, right? So unlike financial, IT, transportation, telecommunication services, these socially provided, government provided services don't actually share linkages with the rest of the economy and therefore don't have as much of an effect on the rest of the economy. So these three specific challenges relating to the composition of the services sector is what also in itself presents an opportunity for Uzbekistan to do better along these three compositional challenges of the sector.
You really have made good points. So what policies are needed to help the services sector reach its full potential?
So what we sort of emphasize in this report is a policy framework which is built around three policy areas of connectivity, contestability, and capabilities. Well, we show that if we measure connectivity by the share of individuals that use the internet and how countries perform on the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, we see that Uzbekistan ranks below the average in a global sample of countries. Similarly, for contestability, which we measure by restrictions on services trade, we again find that Uzbekistan ranks below average in a global sample of countries. And finally, on capabilities, we see the same thing. So Uzbekistan is underperforming along these three policy dimensions in terms of how it compares with countries in the rest of the world. And therefore, we say that there are opportunities for Uzbekistan to catch up on each of these three policy areas. And just very quickly, maybe one example from each. On connectivity, we see that Uzbekistan, for example, has connectivity to 4G or LTE broadband only for about 70% of the population. So that access to high-speed, high-quality internet is not yet universal. It's quite good, but not yet universal. So there is some scope to improve there. On contestability, we find that all services sectors are quite restricted to trade. And in particular, we find that many professional services are completely closed to cross-border delivery. We find that data localization requirements often hinder the delivery of ICT services. And then we find for transportation and telecommunication services, often because state-owned enterprise dominate these services sectors, there are some challenges to competition in these sectors. And finally, on capabilities, Uzbekistan has made a lot of progress in terms of technical education, advanced education, but still, the number of people going to college or to university is still relatively small. Only the tertiary enrollment rate in Uzbekistan is only around 30%. And that's much lower, than many other countries in the region. So we feel that making progress along these three policy areas of connectivity, contestability, and capabilities can help Uzbekistan leverage the potential of the services sector.
So you mentioned that Uzbekistan is underperforming in some areas of the services sector. So what steps can the government take to strengthen and support this sector?
If we first think about connectivity to markets, right, as being the first important policy area, I think one of the most important policy actions could be new investments in faster forms of internet, which can cover a larger part of the population and aim towards having universal access to this high-speed, high-quality internet. On the second major bucket of contestability of markets, here some important examples could be, for example, removing the international gateway monopoly of Uztelecom, and also to establish an independent regulator for the telecommunications services sector. Another important area of policy intervention could be introducing more competition on routes for air travel, for example, and also on the freight markets for railways. So these could be important reforms in the transportation services sector. And finally, on capabilities, we stress two things. We emphasize investments in tertiary education so that there are more graduates in Uzbekistan. And second, in addition to the formal schooling and university system, we also emphasize the importance of vocational training to more quickly accelerate the development of ICT skills in Uzbekistan. And in fact, the government of Uzbekistan's 1 million coders program is a great example of such vocational training that is combined with the formal education system.
You just talked about the reforms in the services sector. In your opinion, how they can benefit the economy of the country?
That's a great question. And this is what we try to provide some estimates for in the report. So, it needs to be said that an ambitious reform program has been launched by the government, about 7-8 years ago, right? And that has propelled Uzbekistan towards becoming a higher income, more market-based economy. But what we say in this report is that a focus on reforms in the services sector is very, very important for Uzbekistan to sustain this transition that they have begun. And what we say in the report is, if restrictions on services trade in Uzbekistan were reduced to the extent that the gap between Uzbekistan and the best performing country in the world is halved. So if the gap is reduced by half, our estimates suggest that Uzbekistan's real GDP could increase by as much as 9%, and real wages on average could increase as much as 8%. So reforms in the services sector could have large gains for Uzbekistan at the countrywide national average level. And then what we also say is that, and I know this has been a lot in the news in Uzbekistan, is Uzbekistan's current accession process to the World Trade Organization. And this is a very, very important opportunity for Uzbekistan to further liberalize its services sector and to tap into these new sources of growth. And by joining the WTO, by reducing the restrictions on services trade, Uzbekistan can achieve three things, along the policy areas that we discuss in the report. One, of course, directly, this will improve the contestability of Uzbekistan's services sector. There will be more competition. It will also, by attracting, flows of FDI from abroad, can improve its physical and digital connectivity to markets. And last but not least, this accession process, this liberalization of the sector can also help attract greater foreign expertise, greater foreign technologies, and larger amounts of capital from abroad that can transfer knowledge and know-how from more advanced economies to Uzbekistan, which can then strengthen the capabilities of Uzbekistan's economy. So these reforms, which partly embedded in the WTO accession process, can then, as a result, really drive the government of Uzbekistan's efforts to harness the services sector as a key engine of economic growth. And I think this ties in very nicely into the goals of the government that have been laid out in the Uzbekistan 2030 strategy.
Mr. Nayyar, it was actually my last question. Thank you for your answers. It was a great pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me.